This is the first part of a series of lectures on Javier Zubiri's Man and God. We're going to start today with Part 1, Chapter 1, Section 1, his discussion of the nature of reality. Now, recall that there was an author's introduction that we discussed in a previous lecture that will give us the goal of this book, Man and God, what we want to try to find out, to reestablish a human dimension, which Zubiri entitles The Problem of God. Now, we want to see how he walks through his process of trying to reestablish that question and trying to answer that question, seeing what that problem of God really amounts to when it comes to us. And in the end, what we want to try to do is tie Zubiri's metaphysical view, his philosophical anthropology, into the quest for liberation and justice that we find in Ignacio Ellacuría and Enrique Dussel later on. So that's the goal in this particular course and looking at this book, Man and God. So let's get started. And before we do, I should warn you that we are now about to enter some of the deep stuff. I know from experience that this will be some rough going. Zubiri is a very meticulous thinker. He's a very rigorous thinker. He's a very precise thinker, but he's also quite demanding. So I recognize that. You have the text in your reader that we're going to be discussing, and I hope you will try to take a look at it, but I hope you won't be discouraged either. And I hope through these series of talks that I'll be able to clear up some of these ideas that Zubiri has in mind. He begins by saying anything real is a constitutionally sufficient unified system of notes. I mean, that's if you could get your head around that very compact statement, you will have the core of what Zubiri wants to say when he's using the word real. Reality. What is a real thing? What does it take for something to be real? Now, I think we all have a sense of what's real and what's not, although I think in today's environment that's getting more difficult to pull apart than it used to be. But letting that question sit to the side for a second, what do we mean when we say that something's real? Well, Zubiri has an answer to that, and I don't think an answer really comes tripping off our own tongues. He says what we're talking about is a system of notes. All right, now we're going to say what notes are and what he means by a system. A real thing is a system, a kind of a system. It's a unified system. It's a unified system. If it's not unified, it's not really real. So it's a unified system of notes, whatever those are. And the system has to be constitutionally sufficient. What does that mean? Well, to constitute something means to make it up. That which constitutes an automobile are all the parts that go to make up an automobile. And you don't have an automobile unless you have a sufficient number of parts to constitute an actual automobile. If you have an insufficient number of parts, you would never have a full automobile. You have just a pile of automobile parts, but you won't have a car. So what he's saying is a real thing is a system. It's constituted by the sufficient required amount of notes to unify the thing, to make it a whole thing. Now, I'm going to talk through all of that, but that's just as a beginning thought here. Notes, he wants to say, are not properties. If you've studied philosophy at all, you're probably familiar with the idea of substances and their properties. A substance is what a philosopher is talking about when they're talking about real things. So a real thing is a substance, and each substance has a variety of properties. So if you take the microphone that's in front of me, it has certain properties on this view. The microphone itself is a substance, and inhering in that substance are a number of properties. Its weight, its color, its size, its shape, the lights that are on it, the knobs that are on it, and so forth. But Zubiri wants to make a distinction between the philosophically traditional way of talking about things as being substances with a bunch of properties. He wants to talk about notes. Now, again, we'll explain that as we go. And he says the notes of a thing, this constitutionally sufficient unified system, the notes of that thing belong to that thing de suyo. Now that's a Spanish term that I didn't translate. Your text will translate that sometimes as in its own right. The notes of a real thing belong to that thing. They're that thing's notes. They're not conveyed or conferred upon it from the outside, for the most part. The notes of a real thing belong to the notes. That's what helps to constitute its reality. It's not a fantasy where we're just making up what notes belong to a thing. No, the thing's notes, the notes of a real thing belong to it de suyo, belong to it in its own right. This de suyo, this in its own rightness, is what Zubiri calls the formality of reality. What he means by that is, formally, to be a real thing is to be a unified system of notes in their own right. That's formally what it takes to be real. Now, many things satisfy this formality. My microphone, for instance, and my computer monitor, and the studio lights, and the glasses on my face. All those things satisfy the formality. They each have notes in their own right. They're each systems of notes belonging to each thing in their own right. So what Zubiri wants to point out here, and this actually is philosophically important, he says there is an otherness to the real. What does he mean by that? Well, think about that for a second. If there weren't, if notes did not belong to things in their own right, that would mean whatever notes something has are coming from me. And all of reality would be more or less me or my ideas. In fact, there are philosophical views that agree with that point of view. It's idealism. What there is in reality are ideas. That's reality. Reality is ideas in the mind of somebody, either me or maybe in the mind of God. But things would not be other than the mind that's having those ideas. So Zubiri wants to point out, and this may be kind of a obvious thing to me and you when we hear it for the first time, that real things are not in my head. Real things are not just a function of my own ideas. Real things are other than I am. Any real thing will convey this kind of otherness, that it's not a function of me doing something. Now, humans apprehend this otherness. And when we do, we apprehend reality. Zubiri distinguishes us, though, from other non-human animals by saying non-human animals also apprehend otherness, but they apprehend it stimulatively. What does he mean by that? He must like dogs, because he gives examples sometimes of dogs. And he'll say, a dog will apprehend the otherness of a dog bone. But the dog apprehends that otherness as a stimulation. Come and bite on me, right? The dog will apprehend the otherness of a fire in a fireplace. But the dog will apprehend that otherness stimulatively. Come closer because you're cold and this will be warming. Or move further away because it's too warm. It's a stimulus response apprehension of otherness. But we human beings apprehend this otherness as such. We apprehend it as reality. We apprehend reality. Now, you think, well, why is he fussing with this? Why is he so bothered by this? Well, it's because of the enormous influence of the philosopher René Descartes. Right? Descartes was the thinker, the French philosopher that lived into the middle of the 1600s, who famously had an argument, I think, therefore I am, right? Where's that argument coming from? It's coming from a desire he had. Descartes had a desire for certainty. And he wanted to know what could he be certain of for sure. And he took a kind of a philosophical thought experiment, and he tried to doubt all the possible sources of knowledge that he encounters. Like you and I, we hear things from other people, we read things in books, we see things with our eyes, we hear things with our ears. And he asked himself, could any of those sources of knowledge be doubtable, at least in principle? And his answer was, I could doubt all those things. But the one thing I can't doubt, he said, was that I'm thinking. Even if everything I think is wrong, I can't doubt that I'm thinking. And the upshot of that insight of Descartes was, the world around him became doubtable. It became suspect. He had to work overtime in a way to prove the external world, as we could call it. The internal world he was certain of, and he knew he was having experiences, but he couldn't, as such, prove that what he was experiencing because of some outside world impinging upon his experience. What if it was, for instance, an evil demon making him think that he's having all these experiences when he's really not? I could be wrong about all that. I could be wrong that there even is an external world. I could be wrong that there even are other minds like myself. But the one thing I can't doubt is that I think, and I think in thoughts that convey a kind of extension, a kind of a bodily nature. Whether there's really a body behind it or not, I don't know. But I can't experience things unless I experience them dimensionally, parts outside of parts, extension. So Descartes left us with a kind of a dualism. There's thought and there's extension. There's mind and there's body. And it's been a philosophical struggle to reintegrate those two things ever since Descartes. And Zubiri, like many what I could call postmodern thinkers, are in battle with Descartes to get over what they consider a philosophical mistake that Descartes made. So if we, in principle, apprehend otherness, which would mean we, in principle, apprehend reality, we don't have Descartes' doubt problem. We don't have to doubt the external world. The external world is nothing doubtable at all, as opposed to what Descartes thought with his certain way of going about answering philosophical questions. Now, that's a longish story, but Zubiri here is focusing on this because of the problems of Descartes' philosophy. There's a difference between what he calls a reality thing, which is its notes de suyo, or its notes in itself, and a meaning thing, whose notes are what they are according to human purposes. And a really easy example of that would be like a table. The table is a real thing. It has some notes, a constitutionally sufficient number of notes to be a table and not some other kind of thing, in their own right. Its weight, its size, its shape, so forth. But it also has other notes that it has only because of human purposes. When we say that a table is a handy piece of furniture for working on, those notes are bestowed upon the thing by us human beings. A table is not in and of itself, according to Zubiri, a handy piece of furniture. That's a meaning thing, right? It matters to us, meaning things. They matter a lot. But meaning things are always resting upon or rooted in, if you want to put it this way, reality things. And reality things are those things which we've been saying here now are a constitutionally sufficient a system of notes. A real thing is what acts on other things or on itself formally in virtue of the notes that it possesses in its own right. The reality of this object in front of me can never be doubted, and really can never fundamentally be changed, if you want to put it that way. But the meaning thing, which is when I'm looking at the same object, the table, the meaning thing could change. When we all go virtual, we don't need tables to put our computers on anymore because we're all wearing Google Glass or something like that, then tables become a piece of junk in the way. They change their meaning. But the reality of that object, the notes that it has in its own right, it has in its own right. It's not up to me. All notes, he says, are notes of. The of is important here. The of expresses the unity of the system of notes. And I use a horrible sounding word, oviness of things, also belongs to the thing in its own right. Also belongs to a thing in its own right. Now, I will get into some more details of that as we go along here. But the notes of a thing, what is the of? What do they belong to? To give you a preview, on the traditional view of substance and properties, the properties belong to a substance, but those are two kinds of things. The substance is the thing, and the properties get pincushioned, so to speak, into the thing. They belong to something else. They belong to a thing. Here, the notes belong to the system of notes. The system of notes is the thing. There's not two groups of things, a pincushion and all the pins that you stick into it. There's just one thing, a unified system of notes. All the notes of a thing are constitutional. In other words, every note that you could think of it constitutes that thing. He says some of those notes, he says, are constitutive and some are merely adventitious. So, for instance, if we were in class, I always do that. I would stand in front of a class and say, okay, what are my notes? And when I ask that question, all I'm asking is, what is it that you can note about me? That's a good way to think about notes. What is it that you might note about me? And people will say, oh, well, you're 5.5 feet tall, more or less, and you're kind of balding, and you're wearing jeans or a pink shirt or something. You're wearing glasses and you got hazel eyes or something. Whatever. You would note a bunch of things. You might note, did I have a wedding ring on? And you would say, well, one of your notes, one of the things that constitutes you is that you're a married guy, right? All those notes constitute me. They're all me. Some of my notes, though, are what he calls adventitious. They happen to be my notes, but they could be different. So, for instance, I happen to be wearing a pink shirt, but I might not be wearing a pink shirt. I might wear something else. The tradition might call these accidents, properties that could have been otherwise, accidental properties. Zubiri calls them adventitious. They're by chance. Today I just grabbed the pink shirt, not the blue shirt. That's what I put on. I'm married. I wouldn't have to be married. I happen to be married. It's an adventitious note. Some of my notes, though, are constitutive of me. If you were to take them away, whatever you'd have in front of you would be something else entirely. Constitutional sufficiency is the formal reason for what he calls substantivity, a certain autonomous character as a system. Go back to my adventitious note as being a married guy. I can't autonomously be a married guy. I need a spouse, right? There's no getting around that. But the constitutive notes that form a system of me, those are the notes that turn me into a real thing. And the word that Zubiri wants to use for real thing is substantivity. Now you say, wait a minute, that sounds a lot like the word substance. It does. Zubiri does this all the time. He takes words that are very similar and says, the tradition calls them this, but I want to think of them like that. And I'll let them use their word that they've always used, in this case, substance. But when I want to talk about a real thing, I will use the word substantivity because I want to convey a different meaning of what it means to be a real thing. For instance, as we already alluded to, the substance view tends to think of things as if they were kind of pincushions, that there's an underlying substrate, substance, something underneath, and then stuck into that are a whole bunch of properties. Some of them are, necessary properties, and some of them are accidental properties. Some of them are essential, some of them are accidental. But they're pincushioned into something that just sort of is, the substance itself. Zubiri says you're going to have a hard time thinking that through if you took the time. I want to talk about a substantivity as a unified system of notes, and that the oviness of that system of notes gives it an autonomous character. It just is what it is, and that's going to be the constitutive notes. Give me an example of a constitutive note. Great, it's the one you see on all the crime shows on TV. DNA, for instance. Those notes. My genetic makeup is constitutive of me. It's not accidental. It's not adventitious. It doesn't just happen to be. That's what makes me the me that I am and not something else. The thing that I am and not something else. So, as I said, substantivity is not substantiality. This is not Aristotle's idea of substance, which is what I'm calling the pincushion, or as I like to say, the Mr. Potato Head. If you ever had that toy, you get this brown orb with holes in it. You could stick on the mustache and the eyes and the hat and the ears, or you could change them around. The potato part never changed. That's the substance, and the ears and the eyes and the hats, the mustache and nose. Those are the properties that you're sticking in there. Zubiri wants to do something different. Substances, and this is not Zubiri's view, this is the traditional view, are subjects, this underlying something in which the properties are pincushioned in which they adhere. Substantivities, this is Zubiri's view, are systems of notes. And again, I know we're in the deep stuff. I'll bring it back to the surface when we can get there. Zubiri thinks there can be, though, unsubstantive substances. And you say, give me an example. So glucose. Like glucose in when it's in my body is a substance. You can identify it. You could find it. You could search me to see what my levels are, but it's not like a thing with autonomy. It's not just some kind of plug-in to me. It suffuses my system in some ways, but I am the substantivity. So he reserves this word substance, something identifiable, but it's not a thing. It doesn't have that autonomous, unified systematicity to it. Ungrounded notes which just rest on themselves, they are the system, are the constitutive notes of the thing. All constitutional notes, whatever they might be, rest on the constitutive notes. If I weren't made up of DNA, and that's just the bare minimum, if I weren't made of DNA, I would not be a philosophy professor. I would not be a married guy. I would not have glasses on my face. I wouldn't have a face, right? So the constitutive notes are not resting on something beneath that. But the fact that I'm wearing eyeglasses or the fact that I can hear things, those notes are resting on the constitutive notes. Constitutive notes comprise the radical root or the subsystem of substantivity. They are its essence. Now, what's that word mean? It's another important philosophical word. Maybe you run across it before. For Aristotle, essence is something conceptual or definitional. For instance, man or human beings is a rational animal. It's like a dictionary definition. And there have been a lot of problems in the history, not just the history of philosophy, but the history of us, with definitional attempts at finding the essence of the human being. Why? Because when you draw a definition, you're defining a space, and inside that are the humans, and outside of that are the not really humans, or the not fully humans. A lot of social, political, ethical injustice are done with trying to label, with trying to put definitions. We can't, in a way, live without definitions, but we need to be cautious about them. Zubiri wants to do something different. For Zubiri, the essence is a structural principle. It's something physical. It's not just some concept you come up with. So for us, saying DNA is not a concept. It's a physical thing that constitutes the essence of a human being versus a dog or a plant or something. The unity of the systems of notes, he says, is its interiority. It's in. The notes are also a projection outwards. It's exteriority. So all these notes, this system of notes interacting, so to speak, with other notes constitutes me, but all those notes project out into the world in an exteriority. So now we come to an important word to define, dimension. We met it in the author's introduction. What is the problem of God? It's a dimension of human reality. It's a dimension. What does that mean? It's the projection of the whole interiority into the X, into the outward, into the exteriority. So if the problem of God happens to be a dimension of human reality, what that means is that problem constitutes us as what we are, and it constitutes how we are in the world, how we are in reality, how we are with each other, how we are with the natural world around us. A dimension is a projection outward of something that constitutes a substantivity. In this case, the important case would be us. So there is a human dimension formally and conceptually involving the problem of divine reality. That's that telegal that we're talking about. That's the human dimension. That's what we're just talking about. Notes are really a form of reality, and the thing, the constitutional system as a unity, is a form of reality. So there are greenish forms of reality, and there's a lettuce form of reality. Reality as lettuce. Right? The notes of a living thing are reducible to their physico-chemical elements, right? Our DNA, right? You can't be you without your genetic makeup, your physico-chemical makeup. But the living thing, the unified system, is not reducible to just DNA. I am not, and you are not, just a bag of DNA. Right? The living thing, a unified system of all of its constitutional notes, constitutive and adventitious, all those notes, is its own form of reality. Life is a form of reality. Zubiri wants to say reality as life. It's not some kind of force or an element that's injected into things from outside somewhere. There are forms of reality that are living, and there are forms of reality that are not living, obviously. As a form of reality, each thing is implanted in reality in its own modality. It means in its own way. So note this well. NB means nota bene. Note this well. Personhood, which applies to you and me, is a way of being implanted in reality. Not all substantivities, not all real things are in reality as conveying personhood, but we are. He talks about form of reality and the mode of reality, and these kind of map onto this idea of in and ex. My interiority is my form of reality. Personhood, for instance, is part of that, the way or the form of reality that I am. And the mode of reality, that same mode, is projected out into the world, how personhood interoperates with the rest of the world. So each real thing is a substantive system with two moments. He says suchness is one of them, or talidad in Spanish, having its notes de suyo, this kind, a what is it? Something like an essence, the suchness of me as a person, a human being. And then he says it has a transcendental moment, having a form and mode, this particular, like not just human or not just person, but me, that I'm here, that I show up, something like existence. And traditional philosophy has always talked about this relationship between essence and existence. They're not identical, right? Don't seem to be. I know what the essence of a unicorn is, but that doesn't mean that any particular unicorn exists anywhere. Although don't tell my grandkids that, because they're sure that they do. This is Zubiri's reworking of this idea. Our suchness, the kind of thing that we are, and our transcendental, the actuality, the actualness of our particularity as it exists in the world. So what that means is, since we do have a dimensional character, which means all things do, we have an exteriority, we're pointed out, transcend this interiority out into the world. Each real thing points to more. Each real thing points to more than it is. And this is where Zubiri gets his important idea of the openness of the real. Each real thing is constitutively open to everything else. And he, again, likes to use these words that are very close. He says, I'm not talking about community, because for him, community means there are all kinds of different things in the world, and they're all sitting next to each other. And maybe they might decide to interact. That's what I mean by community. A big pile of things that may or may not interact. Communication is something that's not a choice. It's happening now. It's happening always. All things are open to everything else. This is what he refers to as the respectivity of the real. All things remit themselves or send themselves over or refer to other things. And what's maybe sounds paradoxical, that's the ground of the desio. That's the ground of they're in its own rightness. It might sound weird. If I'm always what I am with respect to everything else, how are my notes my own? Things are in their own right with respect to or with reference to other things. Respectivity is not a choice. It's not something that some things do and some things don't. All things do. Relationships are specific manifestations of respectivity. So, for instance, we humans can have relationships, but a rock and the rock next to it are still respective towards each other. It doesn't mean they respect each other. It's not about showing politeness. It's being with respect to something else. They're in the same general vicinity, but they still let's say, reflect light back and forth on each other. How can they not? Two rocks sitting on the ground. They do that. They are what they are. They have the notes that they have with respect to each other, but the notes are their notes because they're with respect to everything else. Your eye color would be another one of those examples. You say, well, my eye color is my own. Yes, your eye color is your own, but your eye color is not possible without the sun, without the other objects that reflect light in various ways, in different situations, different times of day, different times of the year, right? There's no such thing as eye color in a vacuum. It just isn't. So all things that are real are respective. That's because all things are open to each other. It's the openness of the real. All right, that's a lot of heavy stuff. We'll review a little bit next time, and then we'll move on.